Hello, theory students. Today we're going to be rethinking that thing we call a fully diminished seventh chord, which we know is all minor thirds stacked on top of each other. There are a lot of things we can do with this chord, but let's start with what we know. The fully diminished seventh chord is widely considered to be one of the most unstable chords in all of tonal harmony. There are a number of reasons for this. First, the chord is made up of two interlocking tritones, making it extremely dissonant compared to major or minor triads or seventh chords. Secondly, the fully diminished seventh chord in a diatonic context is built on 4 different tendency tones, and none of these tendency tones is part of the tonic triad. This imparts to the music a very strong desire to resolve to the 3 members of the one chord, the root, the third, and the 5th scale degree. Composers throughout history have exploited the dissonant tension of this fully diminished seventh chord. Here's a good example from the famous Toccata and Fugue in D minor by J.S. Bach. Note how the opening brings us to a sustained fully diminished seventh chord before it finally resolves. Another very famous work is the Mozart Requiem. The Agnus Dei begins the first phrase leading to a fully diminished seventh chord. The result is a very tense, almost painful effect. But we can see that Mozart is resolving the tendency tones correctly. And amid these tendency tones, we hear this beautiful line, Agnus Dei, in the tenors, which is brought out amid the tension of this fully diminished seventh chord. As the piece continues on, Mozart uses an inverted fully diminished seventh chord, but the tendency tone resolution is the same. Later, he tonicizes the 5 with a fully diminished seventh chord, but again, the tendency tones in the tonicized key are the same. Here's what it sounds like. An incredible passage, but it's made possible because Mozart is following the resolution of tendency tones. Ti to Do, Fa to Mi or May, and La to Sol. The scale degrees are listed above in red. Re to Do or 2 to 1 is most often resolved this way, but can change based on circumstances. We saw this in the Mozart example. But the numbers in red and how they move is something you should memorize in order to bring the most out of a fully diminished seventh chord. Yet, with music, things can change sometimes based on context. Take a look at this next example. This is from the final scene of Mozart's opera Don Giovanni. Like the Requiem, it's also in D minor. Here I want you to analyze the first chord, and then analyze the chord that it goes to. Push pause until you come up with the right answer. Well, the first thing you should have noticed is that this is not any old 7 diminished 7. This is actually a tonicization of the 5 chord. If we're in the key of D, we're looking at a G sharp fully diminished chord in first inversion. So this would be a 7 diminished 6/5 of 5. And the second chord is no ordinary 5 chord. It's actually a 5/7 chord in first inversion. But what's interesting about this progression is that the resolution of the 7 diminished 7 of 5 doesn't follow any of the voice leading rules that we just learned. Let's take a look. In the key of A, since it's a tonicization, let's see what we can find. Here in the bass, we have B, which in the key of A is Re, and that goes up to Mi. The D right here, you expect to go down to the third scale degree in A, which is C sharp, but it doesn't. Instead, it goes up to E, which is the fifth scale degree. This very top note D, you expect to go down to C sharp, but it doesn't. It drops a fourth to A. And finally, the leading tone of A, this G sharp, we would expect that to go up to A. But instead, it goes down to G natural. This whole thing creates a sense of confusion and fear and unexpected resolutions of these voices, which is what Mozart really wanted for this particular passage, because this is where Don Giovanni is greeted by a ghost. And it's these two chords working together that creates that kind of spooky feeling. Let's take a listen. So what we can learn from this excerpt is that fully diminished seventh chords don't always behave like we expect them to. Instead of going to their respective tonics, we can use them to help modulate to different keys, or to create unexpected resolutions, or to simply embellish and prolong existing chords. It's this third category that I want to look at next. To embellish a chord, one can use a fully diminished seventh chord that we call a common tone diminished seventh. Let me show you an example. We call this chord a common tone diminished seventh because it does not resolve as expected, but rather keeps a common tone with the root of the chord that precedes or follows. Here we can see a C major triad, and it moves to a fully diminished seventh chord built on D sharp, and then moves back to the C major triad. Now the function here is not necessarily a dominant one, but one of simply prolonging the sense of C major through this double chromatic neighbor motion in the soprano and alto. Here's what it sounds like. Now, do you hear the lower neighbor motion, the chromatic neighbor motion in the upper voices? Listen in close succession. So you can hear we haven't really left the tonic. We've simply embellished it. And we could do the same thing with minor chords. Here's a prolongation of C minor. And in close succession, it sounds like this. Now, the common tone embellishment is not as common in minor because it has a common tone. You can see that the alto voice doesn't change. It goes from E flat to E flat and E flat. Remember, in the major version, it went from E to D sharp, a double chromatic neighbor. So what's the voice leading like for this? Well, we can see that next to this one chord, we have a D sharp fully diminished chord. D sharp, F sharp, A, and the seventh, C, being the common tone. Now, if we just saw this chord out of context in the key of C, we would kind of think it would be a 7 diminished 4-2 of 3, right? Because the D sharp is the leading tone to E, which is the 3 in C major. We can see that it doesn't do that. Instead, it just goes back to 1. So we call it a common tone diminished seventh because of that common tone. It doesn't resolve anywhere. And most often, not always the case, but most often, it is the seventh of the fully diminished seventh chord that is common to the root of the triad that it's embellishing. Once again, it's the seventh of the fully diminished seventh chord that is common to the root of whatever chord it's embellishing. Let's take a look at a famous musical example by the composer Tchaikovsky. It's from his Nutcracker Ballet. Notice this chord right here. It's built on a B sharp. So the chord is actually B sharp, D sharp, F sharp, A. It's a fully diminished seventh chord, A being the seventh. And you can see that that A is common to the A major chord that we have before and after this common tone diminished seventh. Its function is primarily to embellish A major. But the common tone diminished seventh doesn't simply embellish a single chord. It can be a very effective passing chord that connects various manifestations of tonic and dominant harmonies. This progression is a familiar harmonic pattern that can be found in everything from hymns to Sousa marches. Here's what it sounds like. Sped up, it sounds like this. Now there's a good chance you've heard that before, either in a song or some other musical composition. It's a very common progression. But when we look at it, we can see the common tone diminished seventh at work. This B is the seventh of a fully diminished seventh chord, and it's common to the root of the 5-4-3 chord. This E flat is the seventh of an F sharp fully diminished seventh chord, and it's common to the root of a 1-6 chord. Of course, in theory, there are always exceptions to the stylistic norms that we study. And with fully diminished seven chords that act as common tone diminished seven chords, this is also true. But we're not going to get into the exceptions right now. Let's just focus on voice leading for common tone diminished seventh chords when they exist to embellish major chords. Here we have a common tone diminished seventh chord going to a 1-6. Notice that, again, the seventh of the common tone diminished seventh is common to the root of the triad it's embellishing. And in terms of the other voices, well, the root of the diminished seventh goes up, as it normally does. But the third of the chord also goes up, and you know you're doing it correctly when you see this double chromatic neighboring motion, the D sharp to the E and the F sharp to the G. This is what gives it its embellishing quality. Here we have a string of common tone diminished seventh chords that embellish various chords like the 1 or the 5. Let's keep our eyes open for the common tone, which connects the seventh of the diminished seventh to the root of the chord it's embellishing. And then let's also find that double chromatic neighbor tone. Here's the first example. Notice the common tone diminished seventh. It's the seventh of the E sharp diminished seventh, and these two chromatic neighbor tones that make this common tone diminished seventh work. Here's the second example. This one embellishes a 5 chord. You can see that this B sharp fully diminished seventh chord, the A is the seventh, which is the common tone. And then the leading tone, B sharp, resolves up by half step, along with the other voice that moves by chromatic half step, which is the third of that seventh chord. The third example sounds like this. Very barbershop-like. And because it goes to a 5-7, it does not change the things that we know. The seventh keeps common, and the two notes, the root and the third, are chromatic lower neighbors to the chord it's embellishing. And finally, here's the last progression. So again, nothing changes here. We're still dealing with a common seventh of the common tone diminished seventh going to the root of whatever chord we're embellishing, and we still have two chromatic lower neighbors. Now this is true when we're dealing with major chords. We'll talk a little bit more about minor at another time. Okay, hopefully this gave you a good perspective on common tone diminished seventh chords. You'll have an assignment that will work with these a little bit, and hopefully you can start to hear these in the music you listen to, because they are in a lot of different kinds of music, especially in jazz and 1920s music. Okay, this is Dr. Sander. Take care.